Wonderful. We'll get started and I'll let people in as they start to trickle in. So my name's Paige, for those of you that don't know. We've kindly got 4 people that are already scholars and hopefully can give you some of their wisdom on how to succeed. I'm hoping that this process today can be quite interactive and that people can get all of their questions answered, and that's why I decided to do one individual Zoom session for each so what will essentially happen is that we'll go through the introductions, and then certain scholars have been allocated either to talk about the application phase, so that's the written application phase, and then other scholars will talk about the interview stage. But I'm hoping that if the scholars that don't talk about that one particular section can also chip in at the end with anything that they wish to add. If you are not talking, can I just ask that you also mute throughout, just so we don't have any feedback, and just to let you know, the people that have just joined, this is being recorded for those that can't be with us today. So if you don't want to be recorded for whatever reason, then please just pop yourself your camera off so nobody can see you. So without further ado, then it would be great to get started. So if you want to introduce yourselves, I'll start with you, Connor. If you want to just say what you're up to now, what scholarship that you obtained and when that was, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I was interviewed for a scholarship at Inner Temple, and I was awarded the exhibition award, which I think is the kind of makes up the majority of their awards, about 75% or so. And that was to start the bar this year, so this September, or in September, a month ago. I subsequently went on to obtain a training contract elsewhere, so I am now doing the LPC, but I did get the exhibition award offered, and I was helped by Daniela, who's here, and she was my mentor essentially throughout the process, which was obviously very helpful and turned out to be indispensable to me getting the award in the end. So yeah, I'm on the LPC, but it was certainly a good process to have had the interview and got the scholarship offer. But yeah, that's where I am.
Wonderful. And Basanti, did you want to go next?
Sure. Hi everyone, my name's Basanti. I also received an exhibition scholarship from Inner, and this was in 2021 for a 2021 bar course start. And I also received an award from the University of Law for my bar course. So together my scholarships, when you add them up, kind of covered about 65-70% of my bar course fees. Since then, I completed the bar course in May, which has been a great relief. And yeah, and I'm going to be applying for pupillage in the next cycle starting in January. So that's kind of what I'm doing now.
Wonderful. And Colleen, did you want to go next?
Hi everyone, I'm Colleen. In terms of my background, I didn't study law initially. So I read French and German at Oxford, and then I graduated in 2020. Obviously needed to complete the law conversion course. So I applied for a scholarship for the law conversion course, fortunately received that, completed the conversion, and then applied for a bar course scholarship and was awarded a major scholarship and Duke of Edinburgh Entrance Award. So again, totaling the scholarships, I think I added up earlier, I received more than 35,000, which is obviously a lot of money. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say I wouldn't have been able to complete the courses without those scholarships. I completed an LLM in between the 2 courses, and I have just started the bar course, and I will be starting pupillage next October at Crown Office Chambers, as long as I pass the bar course.
Fingers crossed. And Daniela, did you want to go next?
Hi everyone, my name's Daniela, and I'm hoping that if I convince any of you to go to the bar, you'll actually stick at it, unlike Connor, who abandoned for the other route, but we'll forgive him. I said my name's Daniela. I did a law undergraduate degree up in Lancaster. I intended to take a year out, get some paralegal experience. I was then awarded a scholarship from the Inn, so I thought I may as well crack on with it. So I was awarded the Princess Royal Scholarship, which is one of the named scholarships from Inner Temple, as well as the Duke of Edinburgh Exhibition Entrance Award. Sorry, I forgot about it until Colleen just mentioned it. Apologies. I got that from INA in 2021, and I did the bar course. I completed the bar course in just sort of this summer that just happened. I am currently a caseworker advocate, which is a very cool charity you should all try and volunteer with, where you'll have fabulous experiences. Before I start my pupillage as the crime specialist pupil at Garden Court in October. And also I come from quite a whining participation background. So if any of you have specific questions about that, I'm more than happy to answer those too when we get to that bit of it.
Wonderful. And just for those that might not know, so some people have talked about an exhibition scholarship, some people have talked about a named scholarship, and then some people have talked about the award, or I can't actually, I got it as well, but I can't actually remember what it's called. What's it called, Daniela? Sorry.
I think Colleen knows. I think because my scholarship was a Princess Royal.
Yeah.
It essentially
Duke of Edinburgh Entrance Award or something, isn't it?
Yeah, it essentially just
somebody just want to explain what that is for everybody on the Zoom.
It's essentially sort of an addition to the scholarship you get. I'm not entirely sure how they determine who gets it, but essentially it waived my entrance fee to join the bar, and it also waived your actual call to the bar fee. So it does have monetary value, but not in the sense of I think they did give me money because I'd already paid it and paid me back. But it's sort of an addition to, I think, major and named scholarships.
Wonderful. Yes, that's my understanding of it as well. That I just wanted to clarify. So you don't get two, just for people on the Zoom, you don't get two scholarships from an inn. You get one scholarship, and then the award is essentially to help with your entrance fees, which are about £100 there or thereabouts. So that's essentially what Colleen and Daniela were referring to. Wonderful. So okay then, what I would like to do now is to turn to the actual application itself, and to discuss, if we can, what tips you have, because sometimes it's a misconception that I've definitely seen. People that apply to Inner Temple or Middle Temple think, oh, well, I'm pretty much guaranteed an interview, so I don't need to try that hard on my application. And my view is the people that take that approach don't actually get a scholarship in the end, because whilst you might think, oh, well, they're not looking at my application, they absolutely are. And that's why I think it's quite critical to talk about that and for that to have its own section. So Daniela, did you want to start?
Of course. So I remember drafting it, and it feels like so long before you're even thinking about it. I was sort of at the beginning of my third year, and suddenly, I was applying to go on and do the bar course. I was very, very lucky. I had a lovely careers woman, and I was the only person in my cohort of 200 students who wanted to go to the bar. And we had a dedicated bar advisor for my law school. So I pretty much had exclusive one-on-one assistance with it. I absolutely agree with what you said, Paige, about putting the attention to detail in it. As much as your interview is a piece of advocacy, so is your written form. I know I was asked to speak about the STAR method. I personally didn't use the STAR method. I'm not saying don't. It's just not something I felt particularly comfortable using. I hadn't really used it before, and I didn't feel like this was the right time to sort of delve into it. So I did sort of take inspiration from it by focusing, on the things I'd done and not being so descriptive. But I didn't sort of routinely follow the STAR model of it, and I found that worked for me. So that's one thing I advise you to do is do what feels comfortable for you and what would feel most helpful for you. Again, with it being important, the questions I was asked in my interview, in the sort of, there's a whole section essentially dedicated to asking about it, and they ask about it in detail. The classic story, I had a friend who did a moot a couple of years prior, and they were asking her about what her key arguments were, and that they really do go into detail about these things because they do care and they do want to know about your experiences and who you are. Another point on that, I would encourage anyone who maybe has alternate experience that wouldn't be so obviously transferable to the bar to put it on. I spent a good portion of my interview speaking about when I worked at McDonald's when I was 16, and that's something they wouldn't have known if I hadn't put it on my application form. And I think with it, start thinking about the things that are transferable skills that may not be from that traditional experience. With McDonald's, thinking on my feet, making quick decisions, dealing with difficult people, all those kinds of things I think were really, really beneficial. I think the other thing I'd have to say, particularly on when structuring your answer, is have someone else read over it. We can get very obsessed with our own applications. I spent hours and hours and hours on it. And I feel like at one point I'd almost butchered it completely so that it was sort of lifeless and made no sense. And my friend very kindly read over it for me, who had nothing to do with law. She was training to be a doctor. And she was like, I see what you're getting at, but you're not quite there. And with that, she was able to point out the bits that she felt I could develop further on, that I hadn't made, quite so much points on, that I could take further. And she was so helpful in just giving that fresh perspective. And also, I think a key thing, when it's done, leave it alone, press submit, don't keep going. I mean, obviously proofread it, perfect it, have other people read over it. But when you get to that point where you're happy with it, that's where I'd say your best idea is to just submit it, so that you're then able to really know that you've done proud of your work. So let me just refer back to, we were given some prompts. I just want to check I've covered if I'm missing anything major. So I didn't use bullet points, I used paragraphs. I tried to keep it interesting because obviously because they do interview everyone, as I say, they do still read it and they will pay attention to it. And I just sort of thought, they're reading that many applications. I don't know how many applications the end gets, but I assume it's hundreds. I think they do actually tell us in the little InnoVision book what we get. I think it was near 500 in my year when I applied. And you want to stand out. I know it sounds quite crass, but imagine reading 500s. I want to be a barrister because if you can sort of phrase it in a more interesting and engaging way, I think that would be very beneficial. Again, it's a piece of advocacy. Think about the person reading it and what you want to portray. I think the final point I'd like to add on it is about being authentic and true to who you are. I've already touched on the terms of, the alternate experience I had, but I was also very open about in my application, my written application, about the barriers that are put in place when you come from a non-traditional background. And this was something, again, an interview that I found the interview panel very, very receptive to and actually very interested in. My interview sort of ended up speaking about how actually they could do more to be more inclusive. So I definitely, be honest with them. I wouldn't just sort of list all the things that, have happened and why, but, you can sort of turn that into advocacy about how it has made you a better advocate, a better candidate, more determined to succeed. Because forget pupillage and becoming a barrister, that's all very difficult. But completing the bar is very, very difficult and requires so much determination and grit. And I think that's what they want to see. They aren't looking for the most polished piece of advocacy they've ever seen, the most beautifully written, structured piece of work. They're looking for someone who they want to put their money behind and invest in because they want you to succeed. And I think that's probably, to me, the most important thing to think of, and why I think my written application helped in me securing an interview, because I was authentically myself and showed them the reasons why that background will enable me to succeed at the bar.
Wonderful. And just whilst I've got you, Daniela, just because I want to make sure that we're hammering home the points as well, in terms of, just to pick something out of the application, for example, there's a section on the Inner Temple application where you list your experiences. So when it says, tell me about what you learned or something like that, if I remember correctly, how did you approach that sort of part of the application?
So I got an excellent piece of advice from the careers tutor I mentioned. She said it shouldn't read like a job description. It shouldn't say, I did this, I did this, I did this. It should be more focused about what you achieved and what you learned. So instead of saying, I organized 300 files, talk about, I did this because of this. It taught me this. I learned from this. That was very much the approach I took, because my first draft definitely did look like a job description. And I think when you turn it more, for example, if you've done paralegaling at a criminal firm, they know generally what you've done. I wouldn't waste your words so much on going into so much detail about that. I'm very much more focused on what I'd achieved. So for example, I had quite a bit of pro bono and volunteer experience. I volunteered with advocates, advice, things like that. And those are things the panel were really, really interested in. And I framed them in such a way that wasn't like, I spend 2 days a week volunteering citizens advice. I may have been a bit, dramatic, people were phoning me in crisis and I was helping them. People had bailiffs at their door, and these are obviously clearly very transferable skills. So definitely don't think of it as just a listing off exercise. It definitely forms as much part of the form as anything else does in terms of that advocacy.
Wonderful. I think that's very useful, because actually, having read probably near on 500 CVs now, people tend to list what they did, and they don't often say what they learn or how that's going to make them more suitable for the bar or a better advocate. And I think that that's definitely something that you can take away, that on your application forms, don't just bullet point what you've been doing at the job, or at the volunteering or wherever it may be. You actually need to think about the skills that you have and how they transfer to the bar. And if you Google skills of a barrister, you will find a whole list of them, and you can try and pinpoint one within each experience or two within each experience. Brilliant. Okay, so next up, talking about the application, we have Colleen. I hope that Daniela's not stolen all of your points.
Yeah, I mean, quite a lot of what Daniela has said was what I was sort of going to say, and I fully agree. I think, you know, it really is a piece of written advocacy and not something you should sort of rush or view as unimportant because you're going to get an interview anyway. I think, you know, the written application really can steer the direction that the interview goes in. And so it's really your chance to say, this is what I want to talk about, and mention the things that, you know, you think are the best sort of selling points for you. And I'd really echo the whole, sort of, it doesn't have to be legal advice, because probably everyone has done minis or has, you know, done some kind of legal work experience, has done mooting, mock trials. Everyone, you know, has a good degree, whether you've studied law or not, whatever it might be. But if you've done something a little bit different, and it doesn't have to be something amazing, you don't need to have, you know, run a marathon or whatever, like, and a really great achievement might be. It can just be anything that can then bring out skills that you can then relate to the bar. So I think as well, I mentioned things like work that I had done, which have nothing to do with law. So I briefly managed a pub that has nothing to do with law. And yet there were so many skills that I could mention there that I got asked about that more than I did anything legal. Things like I mentioned in my application, drama, that I'd done drama at uni. I remember being asked, how will your sort of dramatic experience help you to be a better barrister? So these little things, like Daniela said, if you don't mention them, they don't know about them, and they're not going to ask you them. So you're not going to get the chance to sort of show off what you can about those experiences. And then I think definitely, again, the point on structure is really important. I remember I asked a friend to read over my application, and I'd answered a lot of questions in the sort of style of firstly, secondly, thirdly. And it felt this feels a little bit almost childish or sort of GCSE English or something. But it was what I was told to do by a barrister. And it was the point that he brought up as well and said, you're still saying firstly, secondly, thirdly a lot. And I was like, yeah, I know, it doesn't sound that nice. It doesn't look that nice, but it makes it really clear, you know, whatever the question is, what particular area of law you're interested in. I'm interested in commercial law for 3 reasons, 1, 2, 3. They know where you're going with that answer. And it really helps your mind stay focused, because you think then, oh, okay, is each point different? Within each point, am I explaining what I mean? Am I giving examples? Am I giving evidence? And are you linking it back to the question? And so I think one thing that I sort of had to really get away from, especially having done quite a literature-focused undergraduate, was to move away from this really prosaic, flowery language that I'd been using for however many years. That's all great and that's all very well, and in academic law and stuff, that's brilliant. But when you're working as a barrister, that's not the language you're going to be using. Your clients are going to want, you know, their advice, say, straightforward. They don't have time to be reading through all these paragraphs, all these emails, in the same way that people judging your pupillage applications or your scholarship applications don't have the time to do that. So you really need to be concise. You need to make it structured, whether that's paragraphs or bullet points, whatever works for you, whatever you feel more comfortable with. And you can use methods such as STAR, or you can choose not to. Like Daniela said, choose what suits you. But I think, you know, making sure that kind of essentially every single word counts on an application. You know, you don't need to be explaining, if you're asked, why do you want to be a barrister? You don't need to explain. If you wanted to talk about advocacy, you don't need to explain, well, barristers obviously go to court and do advocacy. They know that, they are barristers. So explain instead, the advocacy side appeals to me. Why and what example do I have that I can do that and that I'm good at it and that I know I enjoy it? So I think it's really just making the most of your application, seeing it as something that helps you, as opposed to something which is an obstacle you have to get over to get to the interview.
Wonderful. And just on the STAR method, I don't know if you used it or not in your applications. I feel like it kind of makes its way in there, even though you might not expect it to. Are you able just to explain it? Because some of the people on the Zoom might not have actually ever heard of it before.
Yeah, so STAR stands for Situation, Task, Action, Result. So what that essentially means is, firstly, if you're giving an example of something, you explain the situation. So what's the background? What's going on? What is the situation, very simply. Then number two, what is the task? So what were you trying to achieve? What was your objective? What was your goal? What sort of end results were you looking for? Then action. What action did you take? How did you try and achieve that goal? Sort of what steps were taken and why? And then finally, results. What was the result? Did it work? Did it not? What did you learn? So it is, again, one of those things that can feel a little bit, especially if you're using it repeatedly in the application, it can feel a little bit sort of forced or feel a little bit uncomfortable to use it. And so I think I could write something much nicer than this, but what it does help you do is focus your mind. And again, like the first, second, third, it makes you think, okay, is what I'm saying here relevant? Is this sentence necessary? Does this fit into the STAR category? And if it doesn't, cut it, because you have a limited word count. So I think it is a really useful method to use. And even if you're adapting it slightly, if one of your examples sort of doesn't quite fit that model, using something like that, I think, can help guide your applications and make sure that they are structured, they are clear, and that you're making the most of them.
And just something else on the application form. So the application form has an aspect that says talk about your advocacy experience. Now I'm looking at a previous one that somebody must have sent me. That's where I've got the questions from. And they've just listed. So I'll give you the example. I apologize if it's anybody's, because I don't actually know who it belongs to. They've done bullet points and they've put mooting for 3 years, voted best negotiator, negotiated and bought a house. In your view, do you think that if that was the example for the purposes of this, does there need to be more detail in terms of what mooting and what happened and where they placed, for example, or is just literally bullet pointing enough?
I think saying something like, I think the second point you said, they won an award as best negotiator, something like that could be fairly self-explanatory possibly. But I'd say the mooting, like I mooted for 3 years. I mean, anyone could have mooted 3 years. Were you any good at it? You could have mooted really badly for 3 years. So I think, okay, you don't need to have won the Viz or something like that. You don't need to have done some massive international competition. But if you're mentioning things like mooting and mock trials or debating, the fact that you've done them, you really want to have at least reached some position. Because I know a barrister was talking about this recently and said, somebody had listed that they'd participated in 10 moots, but they hadn't sort of got through to the semi-finals of any of them. In a way, probably would have been better if they just hadn't mentioned it, because now it just looks like you're not a very good mooter. So I think, you be selective with your examples. And I mean, by the time I got to the bar course scholarship application, I had done some mooting and stuff. Obviously, I'd been on the conversion course. But when I was applying, for the GDL scholarship earlier, I hadn't done any formal advocacy. I think I'd done maybe one non-law moot at uni, but I used examples of things like drama. I used examples of things like some teaching that I'd done when I was on my year abroad. I used examples of voluntary experience. So it doesn't have to be, winning these awards and prizes and competitions either. Ideally it will be a mix of a lot of things, but some people just won't have had the opportunity to get that experience yet. And they're very aware of that. So I think you want to give detail and you want to be showing why you're good. And at least if you're not saying why you're good, what you've learned so far. So I know I was asked one question, I think this was in a pupillage application actually, but I was asked essentially, when's the time that, advocacy didn't go well for you? And I was able to talk about a very early moot and the fact that I didn't do very well because I didn't really know what I was doing and, sort of what I learned from that and stuff. So I think you want to be given the detail and you want to be bringing out your strengths from that. So whether your strength is that you were brilliant at, you were brilliant at cross-examining in a mock trial, or whether your strength is that you were brilliant at preparing the bundle, whatever it is, you want to bring that out and not just say, I've mooted.
If I could just add something to that really quickly, we've touched a bit on experiences and the kind of experience they're looking for. When I got my scholarship, I had done one moot, rather unsuccessfully, and I had never done a mini. So I went to a lot of these talks when I was in your position. I remember someone being like, you can never do too many minis. If you've done 6 minis, you can do 8. And I felt so inadequate having done none. But because of COVID, the fact I had to work, all these other circumstances, I just hadn't done any minis. And I don't want any of you to think that because you don't have the experience some panelists might have, doesn't mean you won't get that, because I didn't either. Of course, it's good to try and get these, but I think, I don't know if you agree with the rest of the panel, but my panel was certainly very, very understanding of that fact. And they really, I think, took note of the fact of the other things I'd had, like Colleen said, teaching on the year abroad if you haven't done so great on minis, things like that. So just because you don't have traditional experience or as much experience as others does not mean you won't do well and get a scholarship. It doesn't mean that at all.
And I think that's a really important point, actually, because applications that I've looked at, not this year, but last year, in the mitigating circumstances, a lot of people would talk about COVID and how difficult it's been to obtain experience. And I absolutely agree that it probably has made, life a lot more difficult. But what you have to think about is the stuff that you have done and also what you've done since COVID. We're hopefully, I know people are still getting it, but we're hopefully coming out of that area. So you should be able to obtain experiences now. And I'm sure that the people talking about the interview phase, but when you get to your interview, you will be asked what has changed since your application. And if you're in a position then to say, well, actually, I've volunteered for advocates, or I've done a mini pupillage, or I've sat at the Crown Court in the public gallery, those sorts of things, you will be given an opportunity to provide to the panel. So use this time between submitting your application and going for your interview to obtain that additional experience, because you will get an opportunity to provide that. I just wanted to say, because somebody sent me a message, you can pop any questions that you have in the chat box and we can come back to them at the end, or if you feel comfortable, you can ask them in over the Zoom as well. It's entirely up to you. What we're going to do now, though, is we'll do the questions all at the end, if that's okay. And we're going to move on to the interview stage of the process. But before I do, Connor or Basanti, do you have anything to add in terms of the application phase?
No, I thought that was really comprehensive. Nothing to add on my side.
Yeah, no, I don't think I can offer anything better than that, to be honest.
Wonderful. So what we'll do now then is we'll move on to the interview stage itself. Connor, I'll start with you. Just in terms of the actual interview, did you want to just set out before you start who actually does the interviews and where they take place?
Yeah, sure. So mine was online, so it was over, I think it was Teams, and it was, I think there were 4 barristers. 3 of them were in-house. No, sorry, 3 of them were independent counsel, and then 1 was in-house. I think 1 might have also been a circuit judge. So they're all practitioners in kind of various areas. And yeah, it was online. It was very short. It was, I think it's only 30 minutes that you're given for your time to speak. But it was, yeah, it was a lot more kind of informal than I'd expected. But that was the first sort of preliminary setup. So yeah.
And did you get sent anything beforehand, any information?
Yeah, so you're sent a sort of case to analyze. I think it was a mock case, and you're supposed to basically think about the judgment and the sort of factual matrix, and you're having to prepare that for the questions from the panel, which are generally about what happened in the case, why, do you agree with the outcome, why do you think it was decided in this particular way. So that's probably the most challenging aspect of the interview, I think, is the ability to analyze a case. But it's obviously probably the most important element of being a barrister anyway. But yeah, you have to then kind of advocate about the case and talk out loud and reason out loud. And yeah, that was probably the most challenging bit.
And how long was you given to prepare for that?
So I think it was you only had about 15 minutes to prepare for it. So you had to read through the case fairly quickly and then kind of review it. My approach was to read it sort of once kind of quickly and then go through and reading sort of elements that I think were, the most important bits of the facts and the judgment. And then you just have the facts clear in your mind so that you can answer questions on it. But it's tempting to take a lot of time on reading it, but I think, you're not given a lot of time and you're not really supposed to, because it's supposed to kind of reflect a real life situation of, you know, maybe getting a case last minute as counsel or something.
And so, just so everybody on the panel's clear, I know what you're talking about, but is it, for example, a statute, or is it a case like Donahue and Stevenson, for example, that you have to read through?
Yeah, so it's a case. So it's usually a high court case, and either one on appeal or a Supreme Court case, and it will be about a fairly controversial point of law. Tends to be one that hasn't yet fully been you know, decided or married yet. So I think it's there on purpose so that you can talk about it, you can form an opinion on it, because it's often a moot point, and it might be in appeal currently, or it might have just been decided on appeal. So yeah, it's generally a point of contention that's there to discuss.
Wonderful. I'll stop bothering you now, and you can share any other tips that you might have.
That's okay. Yeah, so I think the first one is really to stop and think before you answer a question. So there's a temptation to kind of speak straight away and go through all the things that are coming to your mind because you haven't got that long, but actually stopping and thinking and really sort of going through whatever answer it is that you're wanting to give, you know, just being a bit slower about it and taking time to pause is probably the most important thing. I mean, they're looking for someone who can reason out loud, really, as an advocate, and somebody who can talk about their thinking. If you can't be clear, then it's very difficult to convince them that you could make a good advocate. So when they ask you a question, just take a moment to pause and reflect and think, okay, how am I going to express these things clearly and succinctly? I know we talked about the STAR approach. I mean, that's a good approach that I think I used on the paper version, but also just thinking in your head about submissions that you give in a moot or in real life. And you're thinking, well, maybe just take 3 main points here and use those to explain myself and then conclude, because that just makes you stick to a narrow time frame so you don't kind of run over. Other than that, I think just being honest and like being yourself. I mean, there were so many questions they asked me that I didn't expect them to ask. Like I spent 2 years living in Paris, and they asked me like 5 questions about that, like the kind of jobs I was doing out there and just sort of small things about living in Paris and how it compared to London. So I think it's really important to show those sides of yourself that aren't just all about the bar and your career at university or otherwise, and just actually to sort of talk about yourself as well, because ultimately they're giving it to, you know, a human being, and so they want to see that you've got personality, and then you can show through those personal experiences, you know, things like determination, tenacity, and things that they'll want to see at the bar. And for me, I think having mock interviews beforehand was very important. As I said before, Daniela was one of my mentors, and she kindly helped me through the process, and we set up mock interviews and we went through sort of mock judgments, and some real judgments as well. And I think that was really integral to being prepared, for me at least, and sort of it allowed me to be a lot more confident going into the interview. So I think if you're able to just get some practice in somehow, it doesn't have to be through a formal mentor. It could be just a friend or teacher or something like that. I mean, it's really useful, I find. So yeah, that's the kind of basics of it. And the structure was fairly loose. I mean, you're given the case analysis, and then you're asked to talk about it, and you're asked several questions, and then I think they talked about some aspects of my CV and some aspects of my sort of written application, but they then went on to the advocacy exercise where you're given a problem that you haven't seen before. And they asked me about arrests made under the COVID regulations after the event. So like 27 months after COVID, you know, after the lockdown had lifted, they were asking me things about that, which was quite challenging, but very interesting. So I could bring in, you know, arguments from politics and arguments from international relations and arguments from things outside of the law to answer those things. But that was definitely an exercise in being able to be put on the spot and talk about your thinking and talk about your reasons for why you agree or why you don't agree with such and such a policy. So just practicing kind of reasoning out loud and being able to formulate an argument on the spot, you know, give yourself a minute or so to just discuss a problem or discuss a solution that you know are interested in, or you think is slightly controversial in the news at the moment. Take that time to practice, so you're confident just speaking about you know, an issue of current affairs in that fluency. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how what more I can really say on the aspects of interview itself, because it's quite short. But yeah, I think it's important to take your time and yeah, be yourself and don't take it too seriously.
In terms of the advocacy exercise then, so you get given a proposition for it. It might be argue for or against the death penalty. That's a simple one. What sort of structure do you say? I mean, I know that Colleen suggested a structure, and that's the structure that I used in the advocacy exercise during the interview. But do you have any tips in terms of how to structure that for or against argument?
Yeah, so my approach was to do, I think I had 4 arguments for and then 4 arguments against bringing proceedings against somebody who breached the rules 27 months prior. And I basically just set out 4 arguments for, 4 arguments against in the time I had to prepare, which I think was about a minute or so. And so I just had those in my head when going through. And then after that, I just fell on one side of you know, whatever list or column was strongest. I think I was against in the end. For sort of public policy grounds. So yeah, that was my way of doing it. I'm sure there are similar ways of kind of mapping it out like that though.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, what I would say is that they don't always say argue for and against. They might say to you, argue for the death penalty. You will, I mean, my approach was I have 3 reasons for, and then I said 1, 2, 3, similar to what Colleen said, which is a similar structure to what you've said actually, Connor. But that's essentially the approach. And then what they might do at the end of that 1 minute, they might say, okay, now argue the other side. So you always need to be ready for that. And don't, when you're writing down during your minute prep, make sure you're thinking about at least 2 things that you can say for the other side, just in case they turn back on you. And that's a good tip for pupillage interviews as well, because that's happened to lots of people. Just a final point on that as well. What I would say is that if you want to take time, so at the start of the advocacy exercise, they don't always say, they didn't for me, I was in person, they didn't say you have 1 minute to prepare. They said argue for, I can't even remember, but I think it was to do with vaccinations and them causing illness to children or autism, that sort of thing. And essentially, they didn't say you have a minute. They said argue for this proposition. My view is that you should say, may I take a moment? Don't just put your head down and start writing your points and preparing. You need to think in some ways like a barrister would. They wouldn't just put their head down in court and start prepping. They'd say, can I take a moment? And I think that by doing that, that's going to set you apart from everybody else that's going to sit there and just start writing down for 5 minutes when they haven't actually given you any time. And they'll say, yeah, of course, as soon as you start talking, I'll start the timer, which I think they give you about a minute to argue. So that's just something that I would definitely take on board and something that I've told people to do, and they don't always do. So it's good to practice. And also, like Connor was saying, pull up the newspapers and just pick out a topic. Abortion, argue for or against, write down 3 points for each side. You know, controversial topics like that, you should definitely have a go at it, and or speak in the mirror or record yourself for a minute and see actually how long it takes to get those points out. Because 4 points, I don't know how Connor did it, but I wouldn't have got 4 points out in a minute. It's very tough. So just have a go at it and see how it actually works in practice, because you don't want to be like that and nobody can actually hear what you're saying, because you're trying to get all of your points out because you've got a list of 6 or 7 points that you want to make in a minute. I think that was really useful, Connor. Without wanting to take all the points away from what Basanti is going to say, is there anything that you would like to add in relation to the interview stage?
Yeah, sure. So just I mean, just to, so I had, I guess, so I was last year and I think Connor was this year. So there might be some differences in the structure, but I only had 20 minutes for the interview, not 30. But I did have more reading time. I had 30 minutes. And unlike Connor, the judgment that I got was very niche and not on some big unanswered question. Mine was a landlord-tenant judgment, which looked at like the extent to which like certain provision in a, like dealing with service charges in a residential lease was made invalid by some niche section of an act that had come out in the 80s. So it was really a very weird area that someone who does criminal law didn't really ever consider. So that's kind of like the type of case that I got. So nothing you can really do to kind of prepare on the topic. They're not really looking for your knowledge of that area of law. They're just looking for how you read through things. So just to give you some context, more specific timing. So I had the first 10 minutes of my interview were on this exercise. And these were the specific questions I got asked. Sorry, I was really anal during my interview and wrote everything down after. So this is why you're getting like verbatim questions. But okay, so these were the 4 that I got. What was the defense's main argument? What decision did the court reach? Aside from the main section of the act this case is about, are there any other legislative references made inside this judgment? What are they and why were they made? And then the last question I got was, what was the court's overall reasoning when they made their decision? So as you can see, like my questions, especially, I know I messed up what were the other legislative references. I had to pull a random number out my ass and I was like, 24. And they're like, nope, 25. And so it's okay to mess up. Like, obviously it's hard to remember exact like sections. But I think the point here is that they know that most people are going to mess up, but it's how you kind of pick back up and answer the next question and be like, okay, yeah, I concede, sorry, missed that, willing to move on to the next one now. So I think they're also testing kind of your reaction to them pushing you a little bit. Then the next 5 minutes were on my application and personal questions. So one of the kind of prompt questions that Paige you sent us. So what parts of the application came up in my interview? For me, it was like the weirdest details. The first question they asked me was, you mentioned that you won a sports personality award in your last year of high school. Can you tell us about this? And mind you, I had done a non-law degree, then I worked, then I did law. So I hadn't like heard about this award in like 9 years when they asked me about it. But it was on my application as something I did. So as Daniela said, like you really like you put things on there, but then you also need to know what you put on there and be able to talk about it. So they asked me about some of my awards. And then what they did is they asked me why I wanted to be a barrister and then spinned off parts of my answers by relating it back to my application. So I mentioned in my answer, I worked at this X place. And then they looked at my application and saw what I did there. And then were asking me like, tell us more about this specific part. So there's a lot of back and forth between like bigger, broader questions and then going back to your application constantly and using that kind of as a bouncing board. And then after that, I had a 3 minute, sorry, I don't know if anybody's here is international, but I'm an international candidate. And at the end of that kind of 5-minute application question, they asked me, they were like, you're an international student. Why do you want to work here and not in your home country? So if you're international, be prepared to have a good answer as to why you don't want to go back. And also after that, they asked me specifically how I'm going to secure permission to work here if I get pupillage. So make sure to have done your visa research, make sure to know that the Bar Council sponsors pupillage, do all that kind of information, have that all ready because they're going to ask you about it to see how well you're prepared to actually practice here if you're international. Then I had the 3-minute kind of oral test that Connor mentioned. Mine was argue for or against the statement that free speech should be accepted within freedom of speech. I had 30 seconds to prep, which they told me, 1 minute to present. And then exactly what Paige said happened to me. After my 1 minute was over, they were like, okay, now present for the other side, but no prep time. So really you need to prep both when you're doing the first one because you're just expected to go right into it. And then the last thing that happened to me was they asked me to confirm my financial information. So you have to know, like, if anything changed in your finances, that's when you need to disclose that. For me, they didn't ask me, like, why do I need the money or anything like that. So it's not, like, intrusive into, like, your financial, like, situation or anything like that. They just confirmed that the numbers were correct. So Paige mentioned that if you've done things between when you applied to when the interview is, that you could get the opportunity to mention it. In my interview, they didn't ask me that. And it just so happened that I had done a lot of stuff between when I applied and when I So if they don't ask you because it's so fast, maybe you're talking about other stuff, you need to really be confident and tell them. So if you can't tell them in the answers for other questions they're asking, if you can't sneak them in, then at the end, literally what I said, they were like, okay, thank you. I was like, actually, sorry, if you have an extra 30 seconds, I would really like to tell you about the scholarship that I won last week. This is what happened. And you do it really fast, but it's really important that they know, because they cannot do anything if they don't know anything about it. So you really need to put your foot down and be like, excuse me, like nicely, politely, but like, may I have a minute to just briefly tell you about these opportunities that I've had over the past few months. So I had to do that at the end, which it was really scary because there was a judge on my panel. I was like, I'm telling the judge to stay here while I tell him about my little things that happened. So yeah, so that's like a bit more that I would add from like the step-by-step interview process. Just like wrapping up some tips now, just adding on everything that Connor said, I like 100% agree with. I think those are really good tips. Something in the prep side. So prep for the judgment. What I did, and you don't have to be like this. I mean, I'm sure you would do fine if you didn't really prep it, but what really helped me was I downloaded recent judgments, which were between 11 and 16 pages long, because that usually is the page numbers that they'll aim to give you, from civil, criminal, and family. And I downloaded 3 cases from each of them. Just to get used to reading cases in areas that I usually don't, because I'm such a specialized kind of person. So I needed to get exposure to all 3. And then I like timed myself. I gave myself 30 minutes, read them, and then basically answered the following questions for each. What is the case about? What are the key legal points that the court has to decide? What are the arguments made on either side? What was the court's decision? And what are the main reasons they gave for their decision? So prepping all of that in a timed manner for each of these different areas, like in the 2 weeks leading up to the interview, really helped me. And then prep for the oral kind of situational tests. So Paige already mentioned, and Connor already mentioned too, like read the news, be up to date. But a cheat sheet way of like dealing with this is knowing all your human rights, like the back of your hand, like all the articles in the HRA or the articles in the ECHR. There aren't many of them. There are just a few of them. And just knowing all of them is really good, because even if you maybe didn't catch that particular area in the news, usually will have something to do with some kind of human rights somewhere. So it's kind of just something you can just whip out, and like usually there will be some kind of breach of human rights. And it's really easy when you might not have come across something to just kind of spin it towards human rights, and then you can drop in like, oh, this is Article 5 violation, Article 4. And so that's like a cheat sheet way of kind of preparing yourself for that, because it's impossible to read all the news all the time. And then yeah, make a list of everything that you might have done between the application and the interview, because you need to have them handy, not then trying to remember everything you've done. And yeah, let your personality come through. I think Connor mentioned this, that this is a conversation, not an interrogation. And I think a lot of the ways I started my answers made it conversational, even though I was being formal. So they asked me a question and I was like, oh, that's actually a really good question. This weird situation happened. So it was really like back and forth, kind of them were at the same level. And I think that really like lowered the mood and made it more friendly and conversational. And yeah, I think that's about it. The one thing I would tell myself if I could go back is that they really are not looking for the finished product. Similarly to what Daniela said, I only had 1 mood and 1 mini when I went through the process, and I did the mini after I did the paper application. So I hadn't even mentioned it in my application, and they really don't care. I mean, obviously if you put it on, they're going to ask you about it and like ask you about your experiences, but they really just want to know if you have a genuine interest at the bar and if it's worth investing in you, and if you have that potential to be a good advocate. So, you know, I don't think you should, if you know you're questioning, I don't have enough experience, or all these other people are speaking about applying and they have 5 minis. I think this panel is like a clear show that you definitely don't need to have any of that. Obviously, it helps if you do, so definitely go for it. But yeah, don't not apply just because you don't have those things. So that's just a little bit from me. Overall, I love Inner. I mean, this interview is like what really honed in why I love this in so much. I was scared. out scared shitless, sorry for the expression, but like I was freaking out. And they were so incredibly approachable and nice and laughing and making jokes about my sports abilities and, you know, like all the, you know, so they were in t-shirts, they were so relaxed. So don't hike yourself up for something like this. Obviously it's stressful, but they're really kind people. I think that's something overall about Inner that's really special. I think everybody's just really, it's insane, really. Sometimes I can't believe it's it's really the case, but it's a great Inn if you want a more comfortable, diverse, acceptance-led type environment. So yeah, that's it for me.
Wonderful. And Basanti, you talked about the three different areas, so the civil, crime, I can't remember what the other area was. I just went straight family. Yeah, I just went straight for crime and that was it. But I just wanted to check, did you actually get to pick the area that you read, or did it get allocated?
You get allocated it, which is why I did all three. Obviously, if I could choose, that would have been great. I would not have chosen Landlord Tenant. So basically, because you cannot choose, you just get the case in the email or in person. That's why you have to prepare for all of them, in my opinion, because you don't know what you're going to get.
And was that the same for everybody else? Because that seems to be something that's changed then.
Yeah, yes, it is something that's changed. But and if I just make the point on that kind of real technical stuff, how it works, once you get through the paper sieve, Inner Temple do a quite comprehensive session, a bit like this, where they have the head of the scholarship committee and kind of go through all that kind of formal technical points and what you can expect and what you can know before and what you can't. So those all technical things, I promise, will be cleared up before you turn up to an interview and have no idea what's going on. Because I realise we've said some conflicting things. It's even changed since I did it, and between me and Connor, it changed quite a bit as well. So don't take what we say as absolute gospel.
No, absolutely. But I think that, you know, as a general, it's very useful to know what people went through. Having said that, you're all in a much better position than what I was, because I'd never met anybody that had even applied for a scholarship before. I turned up, had no clue what was going to happen, didn't know I needed to read a case study. Thankfully, I got to choose whether it was crime, family or civil. So I guess that probably helped me out. And then in the bathroom, I heard some girls talking about the question that they'd been asked. And I started Googling frantically before I went for my interview, and then got asked a completely different question. So beware, everybody gets asked something different and it doesn't quite work that easily. But yeah, so, and I managed to get one, so I'm sure you'll all be absolutely fine. But what I would like to do is I want to open the floor up for questions. So, and if you've got very specific questions, please ask, because this is your opportunity. But before I do that, I know that Daniela had an additional part of an interview because she got a named scholarship rather than an exhibition award. And I think she might want to just speak a little bit about that, if that's possible.
Yes, I'm very keen to get to questions. I'm sure you all had enough hearing us talk and want to get the bits you want to know. Just like to flag, because it's not a secret, don't worry, I checked with you and I am allowed to talk about its existence, but it's not something that I think is well publicised beforehand. And I think that's in order to try and stop you all reading too much into how the interviews went and this and that. So after I was, generally they interview over 2 weekends. I was interviewed in the first weekend, and I was told I'd hear in sort of 3 weeks, so 2 weeks after the second round. About 5 days after the second weekend of interviews, I was in bed doing some coursework for my undergrad, and I got an email from the Inn guaranteeing me a major scholarship and inviting me to interview for a named scholarship. I was completely unprepared, completely broke down in tears. No one was home, no one was answering the phone. It was a very disappointing celebratory experience, very similar to what actually happened with pupillage, where it kind of just came out of the blue and it wasn't when you meant to find out, so I wasn't prepared. So I was invited to this sort of, at that point it is secret, so I was asked not to tell anyone. That's so because obviously if you don't get that email, it does, at least for my year, mean you weren't going to get a named scholarship. I think they interviewed about 10 of us for 3 named scholarships. Not that I've ever met anyone else who's had this interview. So if any of you do, please tell me. And it follows exact same format as my first interview. And I won't speak in too much detail. If any of you get to that point, please do feel free to reach out to me and I can reassure you. But it was a lot harder. It was a lot more technical. And I think they are challenging you a lot more. What people were saying about, you know, they do want to see you push back a bit. That definitely happened in my sort of second interview. So just an example, my first case was a crime case about whether lying about facility status vitiates consent. as Connor said, quite a big, wide public opinion topic. My second one was about whether you can use the New York Arbitration Convention to compel someone to appear via video link in a UK court in, I think it was the Trinidad. So clearly aimed for no one to have any idea what it was about. Clearly they were trying to, and ask you really tricky legal questions. And it was very difficult. And there was a lot more, you'd say something, they challenge you in a way they never did in my first round. And they did say to me at the beginning of that interview, your first round is to see if you'll be a good barrister. The second one is to see what kind of barrister you would be. So if any of you do get to the point, don't be scared. They are trying to trip you up. They are trying to trick you. That is their aim for that interview. But if anyone wants any more sort of specialist advice on the second round and the differences between, I think my second round was a lot more informal as well. Maybe just because I was less stressed, because so I needed a scholarship to fund the bar. I don't come from, I didn't have alternative funds in place. I needed it to do the bar. So I was obviously much more relaxed at that point because I knew they'd at least be paying for my fees. So that's sort of the secret second round that I'm on a big mission to dispel the myths of. But also, if you don't hear the email, don't try and second guess and start thinking those things through. It's not, because you don't know when they're going to email about the second round. So once you do your interview, forget about it until you hear anything else and enjoy whatever you're doing.
Absolutely. And before we go on to the questions as well, I just wanted to say in relation to that, don't be disheartened if you don't get a scholarship. There are absolutely other ways around it. And people, I'd say it's probably about a 50-50 split in terms of people that go on to get pupillage. Not everybody that gets pupillage has got a scholarship. Some people will say, oh, you didn't get a scholarship, you've got no chance. I think that's absolutely ludicrous to say. And actually, people do go on. And people that have got scholarships never get pupillage. So, of course, it will instill some confidence into you that a panel of barristers have picked you for a scholarship. So, you would feel more confident going into a pupillage interview. And of course, you might, lo and behold, get the same person on a pupillage panel again. Who knows? But I would definitely say, don't be disheartened if you don't get a scholarship. And there are people on this panel that have also got scholarships from the providers. So I didn't know that if you got an in scholarship, you can also get a provider scholarship. I didn't know that at the time, and I just didn't apply for a provider scholarship because my in scholarship covered my fees. And I thought, oh, well, who am I to complain? I've got some money from somewhere. But definitely apply to the providers. I know that, I think it's ULaw will give you a few grand just for doing a plea and mitigation. Definitely go and do that and get the extra funds, because you can absolutely get funding from more than one place, and you absolutely should get funding from everywhere. It doesn't matter where you come from. I know that Basanti was saying that it's not an intrusive question about your background or whether you've got a £2,000 credit card or whether you've got 10 grand sat in the bank. They don't go into that amount of detail. What they do look at, though, is that in terms of the exhibition awards, whether or not you get a scholarship is based on merit. So that's based on how you perform in interview, on your application, and whether or not they think you're suitable for the bar, basically. Beyond that, there's then a means test, and the amount of money that you're allocated if you don't get a named scholarship is based on, generally speaking, your means. So if you have 15 grand in the bank, you might get a bit less than somebody that's got £0 in the bank, essentially. So that's how it works. But don't be disheartened. And if you get a scholarship whereby you're given 12 grand, then go back to your provider and apply there. And see if you can make up the extra money that way. Also, as a tip, if you do an LLM with your bar course, you are eligible for student finance. You have to add the LLM on. People often think that LLM means that they're doing a whole master's. It honestly is not. Some providers, you just do work experience, or you work in their law clinic and you just write about that. Or you can do a dissertation, which is about up to 10,000 words. What I will say is, hoping that the Student Finance England don't run after me, if you sign up for the LLM, you take the money and then you don't actually submit your LLM, nobody's going to do anything about it. So that's a little tip. If you decide later on that you're too stressed to continue the LLM and you just want to move on, then don't worry about it. Nobody's going to chase you for the money back. So just something to think about. There are other ways around it, and you don't always have to get a massive scholarship or any scholarship at all. Fingers crossed though that you all do, because you're all here, so you're all clearly keen. And on that note, I want to move on to the questions so that we can hopefully get them all answered before, I know Connor's got to pop off shortly. So the first question by Melinda is, do they always ask a proposition question in the interview? Is there anybody here that didn't get asked? I know one girl that didn't get asked, but I think that's probably because she was talking for a long time about other stuff. But did everybody else get asked their argue for or against point? I'll take that as a yes. So I think you're definitely prepare for the fact that you're going to be asked. Out of the probably about 150 people that I've mentored over the last few years, only one person didn't get asked. So I'd say that you're probably going to get asked that.
If I could just add on that point, the interviews are much more structured now. So sorry, I was actually on the panel last year for the Inner Temple interviews, and they are much more structured. So the only point you should be getting asked questions that other people that day didn't get asked is the kind of personal bit. And I believe the structure now is case, personal questions, for and against. And I believe they also don't actually ask about finances anymore. They took that bit out, I believe. And that's dealt with kind of like a separate part, I think, because they were worried about it impacting people. So yeah, they're trying to be fair and just and all kinds of things. So I back what Basanti said about joining Inner. It's a great in.
Wonderful. And I'm just going to move on. So Catherine's put a question on about the work experience section. She says, I find the word count quite generous, especially as there are separate boxes for what you did and what you learned. As I'm a bit older, I have 10 separate work experience, etc. to describe now, so I'm very conscious of the length of this section. I'm both unsure how much detail to provide for each experience and concerned about repeating myself in reflections in the section and when drawing on my experiences in the bigger questions in the next section. Has anybody got any advice on this?
I would potentially pick sort of a few of those examples that you think are the most relevant and the best show a variety of different skill sets. So if you think, you know, there are two different experiences that maybe demonstrate really, really similar skills, it's probably not worth putting them both, because you could be falling into that repetition. They might, not that they're not interested in your application, but like they are reading through a lot, they might sort of start to rush through things. So I think the best way is to maybe pick the few examples that really get those skills that you want and go into more detail about those rather than feeling you have to put all 10 or whatever. I think it's fine to be selective. I think it's good to be selective. Even with anything with mini pupilages, if you have done a lot of mini pupilages, you don't have to list them all, list the ones that are the most relevant to you. The same with, you know, any advocacy experience. I think it is really about being selective and guiding the interview, guiding the interviewers towards what you want to talk about, what you want to bring out. It's your application. So sort of word it and select what you feel is best for you.
And if I could add on the word count point, and this is actually something my mentor told me, it's, you know, like when you learn to drive and they say it's a limit, not a target. And I think that's very true. And I think that's a really important part of what we're talking about in terms of the written advocacy. Good advocates don't take 10 minutes to say what they could in 5. And I think that's true for the written bit as well. I appreciate it's a very fine and difficult balance. And I think that is, again, where someone else reading over could really help you, making sure you've got the right amount of detail without saying things for the sake of saying things, because that isn't good, clear advocacy.
Wonderful. And the next question is, in an interview, can we ask to take a moment for any question before answering, or only for the oral advocacy?
I can start off that one. I definitely did that. There was one question that I didn't expect to get. It was one about myself, but I just needed it was quite a long question. So I asked if I could just have a quick moment to get my thoughts together and then started talking about it. I probably wouldn't take as much time with my thought as I would before an oral advocacy question. But I did it and it didn't stop me from getting a scholarship. So as long as you just take 20 seconds, I think you should be fine.
Just to add to that, I would say don't do it on every single question, because that's just problematic. If there's one question that you need to take a minute, or not a minute, but a few seconds to think about, then do that. My other top tip is something that somebody told me a while ago. They will offer you a glass of water when you go into your interview. Take this on board for every interview that you ever sit from now on. Take that glass of water, and each time when they've read the question, take a sip of your water, put it down on the table and talk. By doing that, you've given yourself probably about 10 to 15 seconds to think, and nobody's none the wiser. They obviously are, because they're not stupid, and they do that as well. Look, if you go to court, you will notice that advocates often take a drink of their water before they speak, and that's why they do it. So definitely take the water, and if you're thinking, oh bloody hell, I don't know what they're talking about, take a sip and then put it down and talk. And nobody's going to think, oh, this person's taking a second every single time. Nobody's going to question that. But I do agree with what Basanti is saying. If there's a question that you think, oh, I just need a second, or if there's a question that you need repeating, then be bold, be brave and say, would you mind repeating that for me? The proposition, I asked them to repeat again because it gave me more thinking time. They said to me, do you want me to, would you like me to repeat that? And I said, oh, that would be great if you don't mind. They repeated it. By that point, I've given myself 10 extra seconds. So obviously not all the time, but for one question, it's fine. Otherwise, sip your water. If we don't get a scholarship, what could we do? Can we apply to the other inns or reapply to the same inn again? I know the answer to this question, but does anybody else know or want to speak about applying to other inns?
I'm pretty sure that you can apply for any inn as long as you haven't joined an inn. So if you've joined Inner Temple, for example, you're tied to Inner Temple. You know, you can't then go and apply for a scholarship at Lincoln's just because you didn't get one at Inner. But if you're applying for scholarships before you've joined an inn, then you could be rejected from an inn one year and apply to a different one another year, or you can reapply to the same one. So yeah, you're basically free until you've joined an inn. So probably a lot of people would say don't join an inn until you've got the scholarship, because then you know you're not fixed on where you're going. So I mean, I joined after I got offered the GDL scholarship from Inner Temple. That was when I then joined, because I thought, well, obviously I'm going to accept the scholarship, now I can join.
Just to add to that, what Colleen's saying is that if you get rejected from Inner Temple this year, you can apply to Middle Temple next year. However, you can only apply to one inn per year. So if you choose to apply to Inner Temple this year, that's it. You can't also submit an application to Middle, Greys and Lincoln's, because they do check. So don't do that. It would be dishonest of you, basically. So you have to pick the inn. Don't become a member until May, when you know whether or not you've got the scholarship. And then if you're not successful and you've heard from your friends that Middle Temple's much better, for example, then you can go and apply there next year should you wish. If Danielle is shaking her head, if you want to join the inn now and start your qualifying sessions, which some people might tell you to do because you have to do them before you can be called to the bar, then you can do that. But I would say wait until you know about the scholarship before you make your decision. Wonderful. Another question for the work experience section, do we only write 5 experiences per section, legal, non-legal, etc.? I've been told that more than 5 would be too much. Connor, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so for me, I think I just did 5 non-legal and 5 legal. I seem to remember there only being an option to do 5, but I may well have been wrong. But yeah, I just stuck to 5 relevant ones and ones that were quite specific, because yeah, my CV, I'm a little bit older, I think, than most people who'd applied in my year. So I think I basically narrowed it down to those that were very specific to the legal profession. So I did like 3 mini pupilages and then 2, I think, like internships in law firms. And then for non-legal, it was things like I think I did some teaching jobs and then some like generic kind of consultancy roles I did just after graduation, but things that were tied in nonetheless to the legal career. I didn't go down the road of like putting, you know, things that I'd done when I was like 16 of you know, taking dogs out to the park for money, stuff like that. I just chose not to do, although it may be interesting to talk about in the interview. But yeah, I just kept them specific and relevant. So yeah, I think five for each is probably a good rule of thumb.
And just a question that I've just thought of. There was, I don't know if it still is, but there was a question on the form that says, tell me about your plans for pupillage. I would assume that most, if not all of you, did not have pupillage at the time of making your scholarship application. Therefore, does anybody have any tips on how to approach that question? Because sometimes people think you have to have this drawn out plan about where you're going to go and how successful you're going to be. But I think that that's also a myth.
We always go for the same ones. I mean, Daniela. I would say, basically, from my perspective of what I said, I basically said the areas that I knew I would be applying to. So I knew I was interested in commercial and mixed civil. I knew I wasn't interested in crime or family. Beyond that, I was very honest about the fact that I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And that's fine. And maybe you have absolutely no clue at all. I mean, you probably want to have a little bit of an idea, slightly, but I think as long as you're honest, and that's something I think we've mentioned the various people on the panel a few times, you can be honest and say, look, I don't know exactly what pupillage I want to do yet. I need to get more experiences through minis and that'll help me decide. But at the moment, I know that commercial mixed civil is what I'm looking for because I've done this and I really liked it, blah, blah, blah. And I think that's kind of all they'd really be expecting from you at this stage. Then you don't need to start listing the chambers or something that you think you're going to apply to, and no one's going to commit you to anything like that. It really is, I think the question is kind of designed to see, have you really thought about this? Have you thought about what you're doing, where you're going? Or are you just, oh, maybe the bar course would be interesting?
Yeah, I agree with Colleen. I didn't get asked questions so directly in terms of what the plans for pupillage were. I believe it still is on the application form area of law. And in that, again, I was very honest, you know, I saw myself going into crime. I also spoke about sort of the kind of chambers and the kind of practice I'd want to have. So I spoke a lot about my passion towards sort of pro bono, access to justice, legal aid work. Obviously, that doesn't apply if you want to be some big hotshot tax lawyer, though you can still do pro bono, come to advocate. But I spoke a lot about that. I was also asked at the end, which I think touches on this point, and again, is another chance to be really honest. I was asked what I'd do if I didn't get a scholarship. And in that point, I did mention, you know, if I got pupillage, I'd see if I could take a drawdown. That's another option, mainly for commercial pupillages. I've never seen one in family or crime, but sort of the higher pupillage awards. I know someone, for example, who's drawn down 25 grand for their bar course year because their pupillage award is 100 grand. Legal aid crime does not do that, don't worry. No one is getting that kind of money around this way. But I had the opportunity to sort of say, you know, this is something I want to do. I'll try every other avenue, but if not, I will just be back before you next year. You know, I will just try again. And I think that's something they really appreciated, that kind of honesty of not, you know, well, I'm gonna get the money somehow. I'm gonna beg, borrow, steal, because, you know, that obviously wasn't a realistic option for me. And this is something I remember actually speaking to Connor about when we were first sort of introduced. And I think people want scholarship mainly for two reasons. A, for the prestige. There is a lot of prestige that comes with particularly the sort of higher end scholarships. For example, I know that one Chambers this year only interviewed me because of my scholarship, which is, I mean, I'm not gonna say no. And I think the other thing is the money. And I think it's okay to be really honest about that, to be really honest with them. They're aware. The Inn is very, very rich. I promise you, very, very, very rich. They sent this year's drama club to the Edinburgh Fringe and paid for it. I'm not saying they're not very worthy, but like that costs a lot of money. Yeah, Colleen was there. And probably something you don't think of the Inn doing, but they are. So feel free to be very honest. They know that people need this money, and they also know that people want to do it because it looks really good on pupillage applications. And I think that will give you a chance to kind of carve out your practice and your future for them. There are sort of littered in opportunities to get these things across with it without it being such a direct question.
I think I'd say as well, sort of on the money side, that even if you do come from a background, like I don't either, but you know, even if you do come from a background where you maybe could find another way around it, why pay for it if someone else will, essentially? So I think I'd say to anyone, apply, and yeah, just be honest about it. I got asked that as well. What would you do if you didn't get a scholarship? And I think I said, oh, well, I'd consider taking a loan, but I think I said it, and then as I was saying it, said, but I wouldn't actually really want to do that. And, you know, I was just honest about that. And I said, I would have to apply for pupillage first and get the drawdown or something. My set offers that as well, which is a nice option. But it's really nice to not have to do that. And then you have that money for when you're doing pupillage as well. So the scholarships really are brilliant because they're one of the few times people are going to give you money and not really expect anything in return, apart from, yeah, just trying your best to become a barrister.
Absolutely. And just moving on to the next question, when the panel was asking about the case you had been given to prepare, were you asked about any case law as well, or did the questions focus only on the case they gave you?
I don't know if this is the same for anyone else, but for me, it was just on the judgment, like no outside law required, like whatsoever. Everything was confined in what I read, like in the judgment.
Yeah, I think it has to be the case because there will be people that are applying that have not done a law degree. So it would put people at a disadvantage if they did it any other way, basically. So it will be about an area of law that you've probably not heard of. It's not going to be something really common that you've read at law school. But what I would get into the habit of, and I know Basanti said about how many cases she read, but do get into the habit of reading full cases, because at law school, we're all, you know, we're all guilty of Googling what happened in this case, what are the facts, what was the judgment, and not actually reading full cases. And unless you do mooting, where you're expected to read full cases, you might not have actually, you can get through law school without reading a full case. I did it, so I know it's possible. And then you get to there and you think, oh, bloody hell, where do I find stuff? And because you're only given a short amount of time, you do need to be able to find the information quickly. And the only way you do that is by practicing. So read full cases, get into the habit of it, absolutely. And just, I know that people have given you tips about what questions to prepare. I think Basanti went through exactly what questions she got asked. I would also have a think about when you're preparing that, what was the obiter as well. So sometimes they will say, you know, tell me about the obiter in this case. They don't just want to know what the judgment was. They'll ask you about the obiter as well. So just have a think about that part, not just about what the main judgment was. Does anybody else have any last questions before we conclude? Feel free to say them in person or pop them in the chat. But I've come to the end of the questions in the chat. I think that's everything by the looks of things. Oh no, yeah, I think that's everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say thank you to the panelists for agreeing to do this. I hope that the people that are on this Zoom have found it very useful, and the people that can't be here and are watching the recording, I'm sure they'll also benefit from it. Thank you for taking this time out of your busy days to do this. I hope that it will be very beneficial, and you know, I'm hopeful that by doing stuff like this, it will widen participation in terms of getting scholarships and being successful, because like I say, not everybody has people or knows people that have been through the process, and it can be quite difficult to know where and how to navigate it. I know I can see that everybody's put their LinkedIn profiles in the chat, so I'm sure that everybody will be open to you asking questions. Please don't bombard them though. I know that my inbox can sometimes feel very overwhelming, so please, you know, think about it, whether or not you do need to actually ask the question. Make sure you do mock interviews. I know that's easier said than done, but every law school or every university has a careers department. So please make use of that, and ensure that you know, put yourselves in the best possible position. Make sure you read lots of judgments or cases, and also practice your advocacy. Make sure that you are giving yourself a minute to argue both sides of the coin, and make sure you proofread. And on that note, I think that they're probably the top tips to come out of this session. So good luck to everybody applying, and as I say, if you need anything from myself or any of the panelists, then do just reach out. Wonderful. Okay, thanks everybody, take care.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Connor. Bye.